In 2010, we identified another 1%. 1% of venture capital-backed company founders were Black, while 83% were white. This data comes from a report that was published 7 years ago by CB Insights. And it's still being referenced today. I see it all the time. It's being referenced in most articles talking about the disparity in venture capital funding as it relates to Black founders. No recent data exists on this. So what does that tell us? That with the exception of the Digital Undivided report, we still know very little about Black entrepreneurs in capital in tech. And so in our next discussion, I'm going to invite Emile Cambry, Ablorde Ashigbi, and Burks to the stage, please. And we're going to talk, thank you, yes. And we're going to talk a little bit about the data disconnect here and the capital disconnect, all right? So I'm going to go ahead, can I still be heard? I'm sorry, y'all. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce Emile. Emile is a business professor, filmmaker, and social entrepreneur born and raised right here in Chicago. His latest project to date is founding Blue 1647. How many of y'all have heard of Blue 1647? Yes. For those watching that are unaware of what Blue 1647 is, it's a technology and entrepreneurship incubator that has expanded to several different locations across the Midwest. Next, Ablorde Ashigbi is a senior associate at Pritzker Group Venture, where he is involved in their investments in Augury, G2 Crowd, Culture IQ, Interior Define, and others. And then also Burks. Burks is a technical product manager for visual search at A9, an Amazon company. Prior to joining A9, Jewel founded ParkPick. How many folks know what ParkPick is? All right.
Thank you.
Yes. ParkPick's an Atlanta-based startup designed to streamline the purchase of maintenance and repair parts using computer vision technology. ParkPick has raised over $2 million in seed funding. Awesome. So let's go ahead and just, yes. Absolutely. So let's go ahead and dive into our first round of questions. So venture capital is multifaceted, and we're often hit with some of these disparaging numbers of, African Americans not having access to it in whatever capacity. So what are your thoughts on this conversation, or this question? I'd like to kind of first aim at Jewel, and then feel free to jump in here. What are your thoughts on why these disparities exist? And maybe you can share a little bit about your own experience raising $2 million, girl. How'd you do that?
So to answer your first question, and first of all, thank you so much to Black Tech Mecca for having me. This is such a beautiful sight to see a full room of people interested in data and how we fix the issues. But to answer your question, the first thing is, why is there such a disparity? I'd say number one reason is racism. So, yeah.
That's a straightforward answer.
Just to put it out there, right there. In my experience, and I recently wrote about my experience as specifically a Black woman founder in fundraising, it really is people have low expectations, and when you meet them with, hey, I'm doing computer vision for replacement parts, they're like, that doesn't fit what I think you should be doing. And so, yeah, I had difficulty in getting over that hurdle, that people just couldn't make it fit. They couldn't see me and my team, which was a Black founding team, a Black woman PhD as our technical co-founder, and another Black man as my COO. They just couldn't put that team with what we were doing. So I think a lot of it just had to do, racism is a harsh way to put it, but genuinely, it's really people not understanding that Black people do things other than rap and play basketball. And even, so that's one thing. I think it's also, on our part, not having done it before and not having examples really of folks who had done it before. So a lot of it was trial and error and trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And so for my experience, I had over 200 meetings to get to $2 million. And the data that was presented earlier, thank you.
Yeah, that's a lot of work.
Lots of persistence in that. But I look at the data that was presented early, and I have a different opinion about it. I don't necessarily think Black women or Black founders in general have to follow the same models in terms of seeking venture capital. The statistic, I can't remember what the number was, but the fact that there are millions of Black women who are starting businesses, and that equates to $44 billion in annual revenue, I think that speaks to Black women's fortitude and ability to make something out of nothing and still prevail even though we don't have the same access to capital. So, and I think it's a missed opportunity for venture capitalists who can't see that we are still able to be the fastest growing segment of business owners despite the fact that we're not being funded at the same rate.
Absolutely. And before either of you jump in, Jewel, I do want to ask, because we are starting to see more firms have like minority designated funds, right? And we are seeing some venture capital firms also being started by Black people or people of color in general. Were there at any point did you meet with those particular venture capitalists as you were raising money? I'm just curious to know.
I did, and I think I challenge even those people. I think it's great that we are getting on the other side of the table and raising funds and becoming VCs. But the thing is, if we continue to follow the same patterns that kind of the old boys club that's been funding white kids in hoodies, we're going to be in the same problem. So the minorities who are starting funds, they have to get out of the box of the same formula. And another problem I see is that we are so set on, if it's a Black company, it has to be quote unquote social enterprise, or it has to be doing a Black thing. So it's not really solving the problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Awesome.
I have controversial opinions about this. If you can't tell.
Got a lot to say over there. You've earned your stripes, though, so we'll take it. So Ablorde, there's a lot of shade going on this stage. So can you talk to us, just from your perspective in working in venture capital, can you tell us a little bit more about how venture capital is starting to respond, just from you being on the inside? Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been, especially over the past few years, an increasing recognition that venture capital needs to be a more diverse place. And I think part of that is, there's the entire conversation that's been had and the data that's been shown on the screen that's created some pressure. But I also think that there's a true economic rationale that's come to the forefront. That's always been there, to be honest, but I think people are now starting to recognize in ways that they potentially haven't, which is that investing in underrepresented founders is going to lead to really, really amazing business outcomes, right? And so if you think about most places that are underfished, most pools that people aren't paying attention to, chances are there's really good value there. They're really strong people. They're really interesting business opportunities that have been historically ignored that, kind of given the right sorts of access to resources and capital, have the opportunity to be businesses bigger than Facebook, bigger than Google, bigger than all these other things, and don't necessarily, to Jewel's point, don't have to be doing something that's seen as particularly oriented towards a Black consumer or a Black use case, but smart people doing things that change the world in interesting ways. If you think about how much better our economy became when women really entered the workforce. You think about how much better our economy became when we removed some of the barriers that exist from a segregation perspective. Then we're starting to see some similar things happen in the tech community. And I think venture capital is playing an important role in that. And so I'm hoping that there'll be more and more people who look like me on my side of the table, and that the difference in perspective that comes from that, the difference in network that hopefully generates a difference in access, ultimately leads to more Black entrepreneurs being founded and more Black entrepreneurs like Jewel building really interesting companies.
Nice. And so talk a little bit about the data and the reporting that's even being collected in the VC world, especially as people aim to start to diversify their boards or their associates who are on these teams. How is that starting to be cultivated?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I'd imagine that most funds, when they look at a deal, don't have a field in their CRM or whatever system that they use to manage their deals that says, what kind of ethnicity was the founder. And I don't know that people should do that, quite frankly. But I do think folks are paying more and more attention to being in spaces and engaging with organizations and opportunities where they heretofore haven't kind of done that work. And I think they're also hopefully hiring folks that do naturally spend more time in those spaces, right? And so I don't know that there's true data around this topic quite yet, and there probably should be. But I do think people are in their own ways making that kind of effort.
Absolutely. I do want to come back on another question, but I do want to get to Emile here. So Emile, like, venture capital isn't the only kind of funding resource on the table. And with you expanding these incubators across the Midwest, I want you to speak a little bit more about your experiences, building Blue 1647 and the model to train these folks who are like in non-traditional tech environments. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think to Jewel's point, the whole idea is not everyone's going to receive venture capital, right? And we need to find alternative means to go about doing it. Because the problem is, it's like someone who has a script in LA, right? There's a lot of folks who are trying to pitch something, and there's a very limited supply of people who are actually going to provide funding. So there's alternate methods that we have to choose, right? We have to say, hey, is crowdfunding something that we should be interested in? With equity crowdfunding coming into play, that's something that maybe we need to think about exploring. Because imagine if everybody in this room put $25, $50, $100 together to start a company that launched here at Black Tech Mecca, how much money we could raise, right? That's much better than trying to go and be one of 10,000 people who are going to apply for Y Combinator or some other platform. And you probably have people that will better consume your product or service because they know you. So I think, we have to also realize that yes, racism exists. Yes, there's certain different barriers, but we still got to find a way to move it forward. And I think for me, when we first got started, it was the worst of both worlds, right? I was trying to raise money and I was a nonprofit. So that's like the dumbest thing you can ever do, right? And I would never recommend it to anybody ever again because it's painful and your family will hate you for it and everything. But
they're not going to be part of your crowdfunding campaign.
But the good thing is when you find early ways to have some traction and being able to get some momentum going, then other positive things happen. And then other people start believing in it. And I think that if we kept it as just a business plan, that we just kept it on our desk and hoped that someone was going to give us that magic number of dollars that it was going to take for us to have all the bells and whistles, we said, you know what, we're just going to Southwest Airlines this thing and try to figure out a way in which we can move it forward. And I think ultimately that's what entrepreneurship is about being scrappy. And I think ultimately if you're doing things for the right reason, if you're passionate about it, there are going to be some people that are going to support it, but hey, you're going to have to borrow from your friends, families, and fools to get it going, and that's kind of what we did.
Yeah. So I would say this, it's very different to be in a market like a Chicago or a San Francisco or an Atlanta and a New York, right? We know that venture or capital in general is kind of concentrated in some of these key markets. So what I find interesting about Blue 1647 and the expansion, you have them in these cities, and maybe you can tell a little bit more about the cities that you are building incubators in, where they're kind of non-conventional. And so for me, when I think about funding, be it venture capital or even, states that are starting to provide resources for entrepreneurs, what does that look like? And how do you continue to encourage people who are coming in markets that it's super tough? I live in Charlotte where, people that I know that are building businesses there have to go outside of Charlotte to get their funding. They can't get it, in the city. So how does that play out in the environments that you're building in now?
Yeah, I think ultimately you have to build on what your strengths are, right? So if we're from Chicago and I'm going and pitching to Compton, California, there's a different perception about the size of what we do, our scope, and some of the different success stories. But I think it all links back to this data, right? So ultimately, I can tell a data story about our organization and why it's a great return on investment to a municipality or community service organization to invest in us. So at first, when we first got started and we were growing, I would take any dollar to try to get going. And now it's like, hey, this is the investment that's required that's going to allow us to do X, Y, Z to get the outcomes that are mutually beneficial. And I think ultimately when you speak in that data language to these organizations or these municipalities, they get that. And if you have a track record of success, you can really leverage that in different places, because ultimately, if you have a differentiated product, if you're able to produce it in a way and package it in a way that's unique for that particular market, there could and there will be demand. And the nice thing about these smaller markets, they don't have 10 of me coming through the door. They only have
Right.
one of me. So ultimately, I'm providing something that's differentiated and can tell a story to back it up. And that's why pushing stuff out social media-wise and doing a lot of the branding stuff that our great media team does is important because it tells that narrative that allows me to better sell.
Yep. And I guess just for all of you in your work and in what you're doing, how are you guys continuing to contribute to the conversation or contributing data to I think, the wider story of what's going on in terms of access to capital?
I mean, I think being here and having it has to go beyond having the conversation. That's why I'm so excited about the data report that's coming out of this. But for me, it's challenging some of the data that already has come out. And like I said, we can look at the, I think it was 12, 13, 14 Black women founders that have raised over $1 million and be like, oh, that's so sad. Or we can look at it and say, okay, what are we going to do to make sure that that is a very short-term statistic? And in a year when we look at it again, that number has quadrupled, hopefully, or, it's 10x that. So I think that's part of what we do. And for me, it's really important. Now I've kind of transitioned my role as a founder to helping other founders figure out what are the things that you shouldn't do. Please don't have 200 meetings because you can be a lot smarter about that. Yeah. So that's kind of the work that I'm doing now is helping founders, especially in Atlanta, which is where I'm based, to figure out how they can do a better job of really harnessing the data and making sure that they don't have as rough of an experience as I did in this whole process.
Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it's a broad question. I would say when I think about the data that was on the screen, that data is the result of millions of individual small decisions that were made. Of course, there are broad systemic things that underlie that, but each individual one is an interaction, is a transaction of some sort. And so, at least from my individual perspective, one thing I know I can do is do my best to go out there and impact as many of those individual transactions as I can. And I feel like I've been lucky to be in a position here in Chicago or in the venture capital ecosystem more broadly to where each individual point that I do or thing that I do may have a slightly more impact than it would have if I was sitting in a different seat. And so what that means is, when I'm in a Monday morning partner meeting, making sure that I'm an advocate, whether it's going out to events and making sure that I'm mentoring founders and helping talk about the ways that these processes run, just because that kind of knowledge doesn't necessarily exist in our community,
Right.
and making sure that I can do the best we can for all of us to be best positioned when those conversations happen with someone else who maybe doesn't look like me on the other side of the table.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I just keep telling the story that we can do it with the people that are in this room, right?
Yeah.
There's not something where we need some big person to write us a big check. Maybe it's just a series of small checks put together with some sales. And I think ultimately, sometimes we make this so big and complicated that we need this big magical unicorn story to take place. And I think sometimes it's just, hey, revenue minus expenses. It's about trying to build something organically over time. And hey, if someone wants to put that infusion of capital in, great. But if not, I don't care. I think, I have meetings now where sometimes, I'm meeting with someone and I'm saying, I don't care if you write me a check or not, but at the end of the day, I know that what I need to do every single day matters to further that goal. And I think that that's the thought process we all need to have. Because once again, if everybody brought $25 in this room for one entrepreneur, right, we would have 3 founders who are going to be able to get something going and maybe being able to see what that results in.
Absolutely.
And one more thing to that point, I think hopefully everyone in this room can contribute, monetarily, but just thinking about the seat that you're in, the organizations that you're in, most thing entrepreneurs need is customers or users. And so even with that, you can be helpful to take an entrepreneur and say, this is our buying person within our organization. This is our supplier diversity person within our organization. Mm-hmm. This is how you can get a purchase order. That is extremely helpful to entrepreneurs.
Absolutely.
So
Awesome.
hopefully,
Yes.
even tonight, we can make some of those connections because Chicago, y'all have so many large corporations that are great customers to startups. So that's another idea of things that we can do in this room tonight.
Absolutely.
So-
Well, thank you.
I was going to jump in with one thing. So completely agree with the point that Emile's made and that Jules made. At the same time, there's an Elon Musk in our community, right? Mm-hmm. There's a Larry Page in our community. right? These folks aren't specific to one ethnicity, to one gender, to one anything. And so, yeah, I want to find that Elon. If you're that Elon Musk, come talk to me, right? Because I believe you're out there.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, we'll go ahead and close. Thank you to our panelists for your lovely responses. All right. Thank y'all.